So how do you work with trauma? Well, today I'm going to share with you my trauma capable framework. Now, this is not an official framework. You're not going to find it in a book. This is just the checklist that I use to guide my practice. It's a combination of what I've learned at uni, what I've learned in the field, anecdotally, what I've learned from my brilliant colleagues, and what I've learned from my clients. So there's some evidence in there of all different forms. And really it's like a checklist that informs my practice, particularly when I'm working with people that have a trauma history. So let's define trauma first, right? So we're all on the same page. So from the DSM-5's standpoint, trauma is defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So it's either directly experienced, you've witnessed it, or you've learnt that someone you love has experienced trauma or a close friend. I'm also going to include Gabor Mate's definition of trauma. Gabor's a really smart thinker when it comes to trauma. Controversial to some, however, his trauma sensibilities can't be ignored. So it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. So really what Gabor's getting at there is that trauma, as we understand it psychotherapeutically, is far more about the symptomology of trauma. It's how you express your traumatic symptoms as a result of what's happened to you, not actually what happened to you, if that makes sense. So what is this checklist? I'll walk you through it, right? And I'll break it down for you. This is not necessarily in linear order, although you must always start with rapport, the therapeutic alliance. And then in second place always has to be emotional regulation. And then psychoeducation around prevalence and symptoms should follow those too. But, you know, they're interchangeable. Shame and depersonalisation would come after those three initial points. And then process work is always part of the work, but particularly with trauma, this is kind of the crown on top. I wouldn't be doing process work too early if I've suspected the person I'm working with's got a trauma history. And what I'm trying to do here is foster metacognitive awareness. And all of this is in the aim of increasing my clients' resilience. Resilience is the name of the game here, people, just for humanity in general, right? But particularly when it comes to someone who's had a traumatic experience and that experience has left them with some unpleasant symptomology that they're trying to manage. So let's break down rapport. The therapeutic alliance is everything in this game. Absolutely everything. And I wouldn't be considering going anywhere near someone's trauma unless I felt that our relationship had a really strong sense of safety and trust. And that's got to be a bi-directional feedback loop, right? I've got to feel safe with that client as well. Not as psychologically safe as the client needs to feel, but I need to feel safe in my interventions with that client. And I need to be damn fucking sure that client feels safe sitting in my chair. We don't make assumptions when it comes to developing a therapeutic rapport. We're really curious. All these things are great for rapport. We just want to lean into our person-centered Rogerian frameworks here. Rogers is a fucking genius, and I highly recommend that you read more Carl Rogers if you want to learn more about rapport. And then really, I guess what the glue that binds all this together is empathy fundamentally, right? I'm just seeking to understand my client's worldview and my client's experience of the world well before I want to understand their experience of a traumatic event. So next on my checklist is emotional regulation. My client's ability to regulate themselves is going to be evidenced in the anecdotes and stories that they tell me. And that's just, grist for the mill, as Yolam would say, right? That's the content of the sessions that we have. When my client has had a win, and by that I mean they've engaged in a confrontational event of some kind and they've felt they managed themselves really well, I want to explore that, right? I want to break it down and unpack it. You can also bring your mindfulness and grounding techniques in here. I'm not a big grounder or a big fan of teaching mindfulness. It's not my jam. It's not that I don't believe in it. It's just not my strength, right? And I'm at the age where I should stay in my fucking lane. So next on the list would be psychoeducation. Prevalence is a really good thing for our clients to know. So look, it's helpful to share with your client that 50 to 75% of people have experienced what could be considered a traumatic event in life. And out of all those people, only 5 to 10% develop PTSD. So there's a strong possibility that even though your client has experienced trauma, they may not qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. And that's not saying that the symptoms aren't upsetting and difficult for them to manage. It's just helping, again, to normalise the prevalence of this stuff. And when it comes to an official PTSD diagnosis, 50% of people recover within 12 months as well. So if you do get some good treatment with a therapist that you trust, you can move through your trauma symptoms and learn to mitigate the impact they've got in your life. And these things are really helpful for your client to know. The next really important part of psychoeducation, probably more so than prevalence, is symptoms, right? I'm not going to give you a really long list of symptoms here, but I think what it's helpful to share with your client is that the symptoms they're exhibiting and experiencing are a normal response to an abnormal situation, right? Your symptoms are normal. That's why we call them symptoms. They're so normal and predictable, we can write them in a diagnostic manual, right? What was abnormal was the event. It's not normal for somebody to experience sexual assault, a horrific car accident. These aren't things that happen every day. They're not considered normal, right? So your symptoms are a normal response to an abnormal event. Very helpful to share with your client. So let's now talk about shame and depersonalization and the importance of being aware of these things, right? So PTSD and shame are positively correlated. There's a high prevalence then of people with PTSD who also have a strong sense of shame internalized about how they move through the world and how they view themselves. So we want to be shame sensitive at all times. Like, I want to be shame sensitive at all times with clients anyway, but particularly when I know, or when I suspect maybe, that there's a trauma history with this client. So part of being trauma capable is being shame sensitive. And this is a great quote I want to share with you from McIntosh, right? Shame is a common response to trauma because it's sometimes easier to believe that there is something wrong with you than to believe that your abuser, often a parent or a loved one, could hurt you for no reason. And this is why we see this correlation between shame and trauma. If I'm a very young child and I'm experiencing abuse at the hands of somebody who's meant to be caring for me, I've got two choices, right? I can either admit the terrifying psychological reality that I'm not safe in this person's care, or I can convince myself that this carer, this guardian, this parent fundamentally has some good qualities. It must be me that's flawed. So process work would be on the list of things to do when I'm working with people who've experienced trauma. Process work is great because, again, it always gives me an opportunity to check in with someone's emotional regulation and their sense of presence, whether they're still online with me when we're talking about these things. So here and now interventions are your friend. If you don't know about that, I would Google it, start with Irv Yolland, and then just branch out from there, right? But really it's about inquiring about the moment as it unfolds, right? And it's, again, we're describing what we see, we're not explaining what we see. So be tentative as well, right? Don't just jump in there with your observations. Don't just jump in there with your questionings. A lot of graduates think that they're an amazing fucking therapist because in their very first session, their client will disclose all this really heavy shit to them. Now, it's not until you've got a few runs on the board and a few clinical hours under your belt that you realise that oversharing with someone that you don't know very well is in and of itself a traumatic symptom. And so new graduates are like, oh, I must be great because this person disclosed all this shit to me. It's like, no, you just encourage their symptomology to spew out onto the floor of the therapy room. And now you're going to have to mop it up. And don't be surprised if that person doesn't come back. All right? So we always want to check in. We always want to be tentative. And so all of our process interventions fundamentally are in the interest of metacognitive awareness, right? It's always about assisting our clients with thinking about what they're thinking, noticing what they're thinking as they're thinking it, noticing the interaction between their thoughts and feelings and behaviours. And all of this, right, can be understood or surmised as metacognitive awareness. So for me, what I'm building up to with this checklist is the trauma resilience piece, okay? Now, resilience is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. I'm not going to go into all those dimensions right here, but I do want to share a couple with you, right? So first and foremost, all of the interventions I've listed are going to assist an individual with growing or enhancing their emotional intelligence. Now, simply put, emotional intelligence is recognising the emotional state of yourself whilst noticing the emotional state of another and being able to regulate yourself whilst observing those two things unfold. So it's a three-step process. I'm noticing my emotions. Ooh, I'm also noticing that John looks quite angry right now, and I'm able to regulate as I'm having that interaction with myself and with John. So another really important dimension of resilience is depersonalization, particularly the depersonalization of adversity. So that means that when bad shit happens, doesn't mean you don't feel it, right? Doesn't mean you're not pissed off or disappointed, but it means that you have a less likelihood of taking it really personally. And you'll notice that people with low levels of resilience take the world and adverse experiences very personally. So all of the strategies and interventions that I've used up until this point are designed to assist the individual, particularly the normalization and psychoeducation around trauma, with being able to depersonalize. This thing that happened to me was really shit, but it's not an indication that I'm a bad person. And these things do happen to people in the world, right? This is not personal. And that depersonalization goes a long way to resilience. And resilience is fundamentally your antidote to or your treatment of trauma. And finally, adapting to your environment rather than expecting your environment to adapt to you is another hallmark dimension of resilience. So a lot of that emotional regulation stuff that I've been doing with clients throughout this checklist, right, is about assisting them with, rather than trying to change or avoid their environment, learning to regulate themselves in the environment. So they're learning to adapt to the environment rather than having the environment adapt to them. So I'm just going to quickly run through my little trauma-capable checklist framework again. So, rapport, the therapeutic alliance, it is everything. Make sure it's strong. Don't touch the fucking trauma without a strong therapeutic relationship. Emotional regulation. Learn it, teach it, check in on it. Psychoeducation around prevalence and symptoms, which are going to help mitigate shame symptoms through the understanding and depersonalization of trauma. It's not that you're inherently bad, it's just that bad shit happens to people, and it just happened to be your turn. And wrap all of this up in process work, right? We're always in the pursuit of metacognitive awareness. It is your client's best strategy and skill in managing their symptoms of trauma, and all of this is on the road to resilience, which fundamentally is what's going to save your client from themselves and assist them with managing the tyranny of the human experience going forward. So I hope this has been helpful for you. Just my closing thoughts before I sign off is that most of what I've explained to you can take place without actually talking about the event itself. We can dance around the event. I can be mindful of the event, but I don't necessarily need to dig into the event, right? That old school Freudian catharsis where I must dig up the trauma and you must turn into a blubbering mess whilst you recite the trauma and then that cathartic experience will somehow cure you. That's pretty old school, man. I don't understand the world that way. I want to embed this checklist in order to create a trauma-capable environment and a shame-sensitive environment. And then if we do, after all of that, end up talking about the traumatic event, it shouldn't be so fucking traumatizing. It should actually be a manageable experience. And now what that means is when my client revisits that trauma, they can manage the symptoms along with that experience. And all of that can unfold in the room, and it doesn't look like catharsis. It just looks like a pretty heavy, deep conversation. Stay trauma capable, be shame sensitive, enjoy yourself out there. Thanks, team.